Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Joseph White. This video will be a tutorial on sampled legato transition delay and a method for systematic adjustment so as to achieve precise performances which will hold together even at very quick tempos. While the center of my focus for this tutorial will be Cinematic Studio's orchestral libraries, this method is not exclusive to their products, but rather covers a general practice that in theory can work for any sample library with a consistent delay time in each sampled transition. Before I dive into things, I want to disclaim that my audio workstation is Cubase. It's the only DAW I've ever worked with comprehensively, and so this method will be specific to it. There are perhaps other ways of achieving the same result in other workstations, I'm just not privy to them. I also want to note that while I personally prefer composing note by note, and rarely perform parts, so to speak, into a project, this method can still be useful for those who do prefer to play in performances when working with libraries that have a slower legato sample. In theory, all it would take is performing tracks with legato off to get the desired timing and expression, applying this method, and then turning legato on. It goes without saying, but the first thing to be done before anything else is to identify the legato delay length in question with as much precision as possible. Some sample libraries may include helpful information in their documentation pertaining to this, but mostly it's something that has to be discovered through experimentation. This can be tedious work, I know, but in the long run, it will save hours of labor. Cinematic Studios in particular has been good about including legato delay length averages in their manuals, but even still I find that how the instruments actually perform sometimes departs from how they should work on paper, so to speak. So for instance, while the manual for Cinematic Studio strings officially states that the fast legato transition speed is approximately 100 milliseconds, I find it to be a bit slower on average at about 140 milliseconds. To discover a legato speed, simply write out some musical phrases and scales, play them with the metronome on while tinkering with the metronome, and then documenting those lengths in milliseconds. Once careful note has been taken of the legato transition speeds in question, the next step is to use the logical editor to create compensation presets that will be used in tandem with macros triggered with computer keyboard shortcuts. To do this, select a section of MIDI information and then open the logical editor, which is under the MIDI tab. The logical editor is a confusing tool, and much of its function is beyond my expertise, but don't worry. In the bottom of the top half of the logical editor window, click the plus button. For the row that pops up under the column Filter Target, the entry should be set to Type Is. Under the column Condition, the entry set to Equal. And under the column Parameter 1, the entry set to Note. Now we'll click the plus button again. This time, filter target will be set to Property. Condition will be set to Property is set. And parameter 1 will be set to Event is selected. Moving down to the bottom half of the window, we'll now hit its plus button. Under Action Target, select Position. Under Operation, select Subtract. And then set parameter 2 to seconds. Now at this point, all we have to do is take the value of the legato delay in milliseconds and input it into parameter 1. To use my personal favorite string library as an example, that would be approximately 333 milliseconds for the slowest legato speed. However, there's still a couple of things to note. First is that with all Cinematic Studio series orchestral libraries, there is a 60 millisecond delay on the initial attack of all starting notes. So many people add a track delay of negative 60 milliseconds to all Cinematic Studio's instrument tracks. Thus, any legato delay compensation applied will compound with a track delay and needs to be subtracted from the number we input into parameter 1 for it to be accurate. So the number we will put into parameter 1 will be 273 milliseconds. The second thing to consider is whether or not we're working with a library that utilizes multiple legato speeds for one instance of an instrument. If not, we're ready to move on to the next part and can skip this step. However, in the case of Cinematic Studio strings, there are 3 legato speeds in total, and those speeds are of course mapped to the note-on velocity. 0 to 64 being slow, 65 to 100 being medium, and 101 to 127 being fast. So what we have so far is simply this slow legato compensation, and we'll need to communicate that information to the logical editor by adding one more row to the top half of the window. In this row, we'll set filter target to velocity, which strangely is labeled value 2 in the drop-down list. Condition to inside range, parameter 1 to 0, and parameter 2 to 64. Now any legato notes that do not have an attack of 0 to 64 will be conveniently excluded from this algorithm. Let's save all this as a logical editor preset, making sure the save file name is easily recognizable and very specific so as not to get mixed up with the other presets we'll be making. In my case, I previously saved it as CSS offset long, but for the purposes of demonstration, I'll just name it 1. Now we have a template set up, which we can simply adjust for the other legato speeds. So for medium speed, that would be 250 milliseconds, and subtracting the negative track delay of 60 milliseconds, that comes to 190 milliseconds, which we'll input. For parameter 1 in the third row of the top half, we'll set the value to 65, and parameter 2 to 100. Now we're ready to save this as another preset. Following the process for the last time, we'll input 80 milliseconds for the offset and set parameters 1 and 2 to 101 and 127 respectively. And then save. Before we finally move on to creating macros, there's one last thing to consider. For most sample libraries, legato scripting is triggered by note overlap. This is the same for Cinematic Studio's libraries. However, I found that their legato scripting can be glitchy if there isn't enough overlap. So I prefer to simply utilize the sustain pedal during legato phrasing to ensure maximum note overlap. For other libraries, using the sustain pedal instead of note overlap during legato can cause its own bugs, so this is a matter of discretion. Nevertheless, for libraries in which simply note overlap is the best way to trigger legato transitions, we'll need to make one last preset in the logical editor. To save time, load up the very first preset we saved for the slow legato transition. If you follow the instructions for multiple legato speeds, we'll need to remove the third row added to the top half of the logical editor as it's not needed anymore. Next, in the bottom half of the window, select position in the action target column and change it to length. Now in the operation column, select not set and change it to add. And under parameter 2, change it from PPQ to seconds. Now all we have to do is set parameter 1 to the desired amount of overlap in milliseconds. Let's do 10 and then save the preset. Okay, we're finally ready to make a macro. Under File, open the window Key Commands. At the bottom of the Key Command window, click Show Macros. Click on New Macro, and then name it something useful. For the sake of demonstration, I won't be. Select the newly created macro if it isn't already. Now in the Commands portion of the window, scroll to Process Logical Preset. And select the relevant presets, in my case 1, 2, and 3, and add them one by one to the macro by clicking Add command after selecting each one. Now scroll to the MIDI folder in Commands, select Legato, and add it to the lineup of commands. This is simply to ensure that all the notes in the phrases we're compensating for are connected. Lastly, we'll add our legato note overlap command back in the Process Logical Preset folder, which in my case is number 4. It's important to note that the priority of the commands does depend on their order, so keep that in mind when making your own macros. At this point, all that's left is to assign a keyboard shortcut to what we've created. We'll need to scroll to the macro folder in the commands portion of the window. Select our command, and then just click on the little box below the text Type in Key on the right side of the window and type in your keyboard command. In my case, I'll be assigning Alt-Shift-1. Then click Assign. I didn't want to replace any commonly used shortcuts already in use, so I used the keys Alt plus Shift plus the first letter of the instrument being used, or a letter closely associated with the instrument. So for the trumpet I used Alt-Shift-T, for the trombone I used Alt-Shift-B, like the abbreviation BONES. One last thing to consider, especially if you're going to be creating a lot of these macros, is to save your command mapping as a preset itself. I named mine Orchestral Setup, and then the date I created. And there you have it. Now we're ready to try out our new macro on a performance. So we'll open up a MIDI performance, which has been perfectly quantized to the beat. You'll notice that this bit of music has a rest in the middle, so we'll need to keep that in mind when applying the macro. Let's draw a note way out of range in the space of the rest, and also one at the end of the performance. These notes are simply to keep the legato command from filling the empty spaces in the performance. Now select all the notes in the performance except the starting notes of each phrase, and the rest and ending notes we added. Input the key command for the desired macro, in my case, Alt-Shift-1. Now we simply delete the spacer notes, and the performance is all set. Let's play back our MIDI performance. I'll note one final step which I like, but may not be necessary for you, which is to assign the shortcut Ctrl-X to the MIDI command Delete Overlaps Poly, normally found in the subcategory Functions in the MIDI tab of Cubase. Before deleting the spacer notes, I'll select them and any end-of-phrase notes that come before them, and then hit Ctrl-X. This just ensures that my ending notes are precise. Plus, having this command easily accessible is extremely useful in any number of other situations, namely legato repetition notes, which I find myself using quite often with Cinematic Studio libraries. And that about wraps it up. If this video was helpful for you, I would appreciate a like, and if this sort of video is something you'd like to see more of, do let me know in the comments section. Happy composing!